The sun rose slowly over Somerton Beach, casting a pale golden light across the quiet shoreline. The sea was calm that morning, its waves moving gently as if trying not to disturb the stillness. The air carried the faint smell of salt, and the beach was almost empty, except for a few early walkers enjoying the cool breeze before the heat of the day arrived. It was the kind of peaceful morning where nothing unusual was expected to happen. That calm was broken when a man walking along the beach noticed someone lying against the seawall. At first, it did not seem alarming. The man appeared to be resting, leaning back comfortably with his legs stretched out in front of him. His head rested against the concrete wall, his face turned slightly toward the sea. He was dressed neatly in a brown suit, a white shirt underneath, and polished shoes that looked well cared for. A cigarette sat tucked behind his ear, as if he had planned to smoke it later. Everything about him suggested quiet relaxation. The passerby slowed down, watching for movement. The man did not stay. No rise and fall of the chest could be seen. Assuming he was simply sleeping off a long night, the passerby continued on. But as more people passed by, something began to feel wrong. The man had not changed position. His posture remained exactly the same, stiff and unmoving. Eventually, curiosity turned into concern. Someone gently shook him. There was no response. Police were called, and soon the peaceful beach filled with murmurs and flashing lights. Officers approached the body carefully. Up close, the man's face looked calm but lifeless. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted. There were no signs of pain or struggle. No bruises. No blood. He looked like a man who had simply decided to sit down and never get back up. When the officers searched his pockets, they expected to find something, anything, that could tell them who he was. A wallet, a letter, a train ticket. But there was nothing. His pockets were almost empty. No identification. No money. No personal items. Even the labels inside his clothes had been carefully cut out, as if someone had deliberately removed every trace that could lead back to his origin. This detail unsettled the officers more than anything else. People lose wallets all the time, but cutting labels out of clothing required intention. It suggested planning. It suggested secrecy. The body was transported to the morgue for examination, and the mystery deepened almost immediately. Doctors could not find a clear cause of death. There were no injuries, no signs of a heart attack, and no evidence of drowning. However, when they examined his internal organs, they found something disturbing. Certain organs showed signs consistent with poisoning. Yet when toxicology tests were run, no known poison appeared in his system. It was as if the man had been killed by something invisible. The newspapers quickly picked up the story. Headlines spoke of a mystery man found dead on Somerton Beach. Soon, the public gave him a name of their own. The Somerton Man photos of his face were printed across the country. Artists drew sketches based on witness descriptions, hoping someone would recognize him. No one did. The man's appearance raised even more questions. His hands were smooth, free of calluses, suggesting he did not do physical labor. His shoes were clean, with little wear on the soles. His suit, though ordinary, was well fitted. He looked like someone educated, someone who lived a careful life. But if he belonged to society, why did no one claim him? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered details that only added to the strangeness. The man's posture when found suggested he had not collapsed suddenly. He appeared to have calmly lowered himself against the wall, crossing one leg over the other. This detail led some to believe he knew he was dying, that he chose that spot deliberately, that the beach was not a random location, but a final destination. Doctors estimated he had been dead for several hours before being discovered. That meant he had died during the night, alone, while the waves continued to move beside him and the city slept just beyond the dunes. No one heard him cry out. No one saw him arrive. He seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Police retraced the area, asking nearby residents if they had seen anything unusual. Some reported seeing a man matching his description the night before, standing near the beach. One witness even claimed they saw him lift his arm slightly, as if waving or pointing, before letting it fall back to the ground. At the time, it did not seem important. Now, it felt chilling. Was that his final movement? As days passed, frustration grew within the investigation team. Every normal path to identification failed. Fingerprints were sent across the country, even internationally. No matches came back. Dental records were checked. Nothing. It was as if the man had lived outside all systems of record, leaving no trace behind. The idea that someone could exist so completely without documentation disturbed the public. People wrote letters to the police, suggesting names, theories, even claiming they recognized him. Each lead led nowhere. Every hope collapsed into silence. Rumors began to spread. Some said he was a foreigner. Others believed he was a runaway. A few whispered darker ideas, suggesting government involvement or secret missions. The fact that he was found during a tense political era only fueled speculation. People wanted answers, and when none came, imagination filled the gap. Yet despite all the theories, one truth remained unshaken. A man had died alone on a beach, carrying no name, no history, and no explanation. His life had ended quietly, but his death had opened a door to one of the strangest mysteries anyone had ever seen. As the body lay in the morgue, untouched by time but surrounded by unanswered questions, investigators could not shake the feeling that this was not an ordinary case. There was intention behind every missing detail, purpose behind every erased label, meaning behind his calm final pose. This was not just a man who died. This was a man who vanished. And somewhere, hidden beneath layers of silence and secrets, his story was waiting to be uncovered. The investigation moved forward, but instead of bringing clarity, each new discovery only deepened the mystery. With no identity and no clear cause of death, police began to focus on the smallest details, hoping that something overlooked might finally speak. Every item connected to the Somerton man was examined again and again, as if the truth might suddenly reveal itself under stronger light. During a second, more careful examination of the man's clothing, an officer noticed something unusual. Sewn deep inside the waistband of his trousers was a tiny hidden pocket. It was not the kind found in ordinary clothing. It looked custom-made, carefully stitched, as though it had been added for a special purpose. Inside it was a small, tightly rolled piece of paper, worn slightly at the edges but protected from damage. When the paper was unrolled, two words were revealed. Tamamshid. The phrase meant nothing to the officers at first. It was clearly not English. Linguists were called in, and soon the meaning was confirmed. The words were Persian, taken from classical poetry. They translated to it as finished or the end. The message felt final, deliberate, and deeply personal. It sounded less like a random note, and more like a farewell. The discovery shocked investigators. This was the first real clue the Somerton man had left behind, and it raised far more questions than it answered. Why carry such a message? Why hide it so carefully? And why choose words that suggested completion, or even surrender? The media exploded with speculation. Some believed it was a suicide note. Others argued it was a philosophical statement. A few suggested it was a signal, a coded phrase meant for someone else. Whatever its purpose, it was clear that the man had wanted the message to be found, but only after his death. Police searched libraries and bookstores, trying to trace the origin of the words. Eventually, experts identified the source as a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book of poetry that explored life, fate, and mortality. The phrase Tamamshid traditionally appeared at the end of the book, marking its conclusion. The implication was chilling. The Somerton man had torn the final words from a book and carried them to his death. But where was the book? For weeks, there was no answer. Then a man came forward with a strange story. He claimed that on the night before the body was discovered, he had parked his car near the beach. When he returned the next morning, he found a book lying on the back seat. The doors had been unlocked, but nothing else appeared disturbed. He had assumed it was a prank or mistake and thought little of it at the time. When police examined the book, their blood ran cold. It was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and the final page had been torn out. The torn edge matched perfectly with the paper found in the Somerton man's pocket. The connection was undeniable. Somehow, this book was linked directly to the dead man. But how it ended up in a stranger's car remained a mystery. Had the Somerton man placed it there? Or had someone else done it for him? As if the book itself was not strange enough, investigators soon noticed something else. On the back pages, faintly written in pencil, were several lines of letters. They did not form words. They did not follow any obvious pattern. They looked like nonsense at first glance, but something about their structure suggested otherwise. It looked like a code. Experts in cryptography were called in. Mathematicians, linguists, and codebreakers studied the letters closely. They tested known encryption methods, military ciphers, and literary codes. Some believed the letters were the first letters of lines from the poem. Others thought they represented coordinates, names, or instructions. Every theory failed. No one could break the code. The letters refused to arrange themselves into meaning, as if they were deliberately designed to remain silent. The frustration among investigators grew stronger. This was the clearest sign yet that the Somerton man had lived a life filled with secrets, but the key to understanding those secrets was missing. The book also contained a phone number written faintly on the inside cover. It belonged to a woman living in a quiet neighborhood not far from the beach. At the time, police did not yet understand the importance of this number, but they carefully recorded it, sensing it might lead somewhere important. Meanwhile, the public became obsessed with the case. Newspapers printed images of the coded letters, inviting readers to solve the mystery themselves. Amateur code breakers spent nights staring at the sequences, convinced they were on the verge of a breakthrough. Letters flooded police stations with theories, suggestions, and wild accusations. Some believed the Somerton man was a spy, and the code was a message for foreign agents. Others claimed it was the writing of a disturbed mind, a meaningless pattern created by someone struggling with inner demons. A few insisted it was romantic in nature, a secret message between lovers, hidden in plain sight. But despite all the attention, nothing concrete emerged. As investigators retraced the man's final known movements, they focused on the hours before his death. He had arrived in the city by train, carrying a suitcase. That suitcase was later found at a nearby station, left behind in a locker. Inside were clothes similar to the ones he had worn on the beach. Once again, all labels had been removed. Even more unsettling, some items appeared unused, as if he had bought them just for the journey. There were no personal letters inside. No diary. No photographs. No sign of a life lived beyond that moment. The precision of the erasure disturbed the investigators deeply. This was not carelessness. This was control. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure the man could not be traced. Whether that someone was the Somerton man himself or another unseen hand remained unclear. The phrase tamam should now felt heavier with meaning. It no longer sounded like poetry. It sounded like a decision. A final chapter closed deliberately, with nothing left behind. As days turned into weeks, the case grew colder, yet the unease surrounding it only intensified. The Somerton man had left clues, but they pointed in no clear direction. Each discovery felt like standing before a locked door, holding a key that did not quite fit. Investigators began to suspect that the truth was not just hidden, but protected. Protected by time, by silence, and by choices made long before the man ever reached the beach. The message in his pocket said it all. It is finished. But for those searching for answers, it felt like nothing had even begun. Just when the investigation seemed trapped in a maze of unanswered questions, one small detail from the mysterious poetry book began to draw serious attention. Written faintly inside the back cover was a phone number. It was so lightly penciled that it could have been missed entirely, as if the person who wrote it never intended it to last. At first, police treated it as just another dead end. After all, the case was already filled with clues that led nowhere. But something about this number felt different. The phone number belonged to a woman living only a short distance from Somerton Beach. Her house was quiet, modest, and unremarkable, standing in a calm neighborhood where people rarely expected trouble. When officers arrived at her door, she introduced herself politely. She worked as a nurse and appeared composed, but the calm did not last long. When police explained why they were there and showed her a plaster cast made from the face of the Somerton man, her reaction was immediate and impossible to ignore. Her face drained of color. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but could not find the words. For a brief moment, she looked like someone staring at a ghost. She quickly regained her composure and insisted she had never seen the man before. The officers noted her response carefully. People often reacted strongly to death, especially when confronted with a lifelike cast, but something about her shock felt deeper. It was not just surprise. It was recognition mixed with fear. The nurse explained that years earlier, during the war, she had owned a copy of the Robert of Omar Khayyam. She said she had given it to a man she knew at the time, a soldier passing through the city. According to her, that man was not the Somerton Man. She claimed she had no idea how her phone number ended up inside the book found in the car, and she denied any connection to the dead stranger. Her words were calm, but her body language told a different story. Her hands trembled slightly. She avoided direct eye contact. Her answers were carefully measured, as if she were choosing each one with great caution. When police asked if the Somerton Man could have been the same man she had known years earlier, she firmly said no. Yet doubt lingered in the room. The investigation took a strange turn when police learned more about the nurse's personal life. She had a young son, a quiet boy who stayed mostly out of sight during the questioning. At first, there was no reason to involve him. But as investigators studied the Somerton Man's autopsy report, something unexpected emerged. The dead man had rare physical traits. One of them was an unusual shape of the ear, something seen in only a small percentage of the population. Another was a dental feature so uncommon that it immediately caught the attention of medical experts. When these traits were compared with the nurse's son, the similarities were undeniable. The same rare features appeared in both. The chances of this being a coincidence were extremely low. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. If the Somerton Man shared these traits with the boy, there was a strong possibility of a biological connection. The unspoken question now hung heavily in the air. Was the Somerton Man the boy's father? If that was true, it changed everything. It suggested that the nurse knew far more than she was admitting. It suggested that the Somerton Man had once lived a normal life, formed relationships, and left behind someone who remembered him. It also raised a painful possibility. Perhaps the nurse was protecting a secret, one that could damage her reputation, her family, or her safety. When police returned with further questions, the nurse became defensive. She repeated her claims, insisting she had never known the man on the beach. She refused to explain her earlier reaction in detail and declined to discuss her past relationships further. Shortly after these interviews, she moved away from the area, leaving behind only more silence. Her sudden departure felt like a final door closing. The public was stunned when hints of this connection began to leak into newspapers. Speculation exploded. Some believed the Somerton Man had been a tragic lover, rejected and forgotten. Others believed he had lived a double life, hiding his true identity from those closest to him. A few darker theories suggested blackmail, betrayal, or even involvement in intelligence work that forced the nurse into silence. Despite all the rumors, no proof could be found to confirm the relationship. At the time, DNA testing did not exist, and physical similarities alone were not enough to establish the truth. The case hovered in a painful gray area, where possibilities were clear but confirmation was impossible. As investigators reviewed the nurse's statements again, small details stood out. She had said the man she gave the book to during the war was a soldier. She had also mentioned that she believed he had died. That belief now seemed uncertain. What if he had not died at all? What if he had returned years later, changed, unrecognizable, carrying secrets he could not share? And what if Somerton Beach was the place where those secrets finally caught up with him? The phone number in the book now felt less like a random clue and more like a silent cry. A connection left behind, faint but intentional. If the Somerton Man wanted to disappear completely, why leave a trace that led straight to someone who might recognize him? Some investigators believed it was not a mistake. They believed he wanted to be found, at least by one person. Perhaps he hoped she would come forward. Perhaps he wanted her to know what had happened. Or perhaps he was testing fate, leaving his final chapter in the hands of chance. The idea that the Somerton Man might have been emotionally tied to the nurse added a new layer of tragedy to the case. It transformed him from a faceless mystery into a man capable of love, regret, and longing. His final message, Tamamshid, now felt less cold and more sorrowful. Not just an ending, but the closing of a life filled with unresolved choices. As time passed, the nurse refused all further contact with police and journalists. She lived the rest of her life in privacy, never publicly changing her story. With her silence, a vital piece of the puzzle remained locked away forever. Investigators were left with haunting questions. Did she recognize the Somerton man the moment she saw his face? Was her shock driven by guilt, fear, or grief? Had she once loved him, or had he been someone she desperately needed to forget? The truth remained just out of reach. The case now stood at a crossroads. It was no longer just about an unidentified body. It was about relationships hidden beneath layers of secrecy, about choices made in desperate times, and about the heavy cost of silence. As the years rolled on, witnesses aged, memories faded, and opportunities slipped away. What remained was a story marked by one woman's reaction, one child's resemblance, and one man's decision to die without a name. The Somerton man was no longer just a mystery to be solved. He was a human shadow, stretching across lives he may have touched, leaving behind echoes instead of answers. As the years passed and the trail of personal connections faded into silence, investigators began to look in a different direction. If the Somerton man could not be understood through ordinary life, perhaps his world had never been ordinary at all. Slowly, almost reluctantly, a new idea took hold within the investigation. What if this was not a simple mystery of identity, but something far more dangerous? What if the Somerton man had lived in the shadows of international secrets? The timing of his death made this theory difficult to ignore. The world was entering a period of deep tension. Governments watched one another with suspicion. Information had become a weapon, and those who carried it lived carefully, often under false names. In this climate, disappearing without a trace was not unusual. In fact, it was sometimes necessary. The Somerton man fit too many of the signs. His clothing was neat but unremarkable, the kind chosen to avoid attention. His suitcase contained nothing personal, only carefully selected items. Every label had been removed, not torn accidentally but cut with precision. This was the behavior of someone trained to leave no trail. Someone who knew the value of anonymity. Then there was the code. Coded messages were the language of spies, and the strange letters found inside the poetry book refused to behave like random scribbles. Experts revisited them again, this time through the lens of intelligence work. They noticed patterns that suggested deliberate structure, even if the meaning remained hidden. It was possible that the code was incomplete, or that a crucial part of it was missing. Without the full context, it could never be solved. The phrase tamam shid took on a darker tone under this theory. It no longer sounded poetic. It sounded final, like the closing line of a mission report. It could have meant the operation was complete. Or worse, that the man himself had become a liability. Speculation grew stronger when investigators reviewed the autopsy results once more. The signs of poisoning without detectable toxins pointed toward substances known only in specialized circles. Satan poisons were rumored to leave little trace, designed specifically for quiet deaths that mimic natural causes. These were not tools of ordinary criminals. These were tools of intelligence agencies. Even the man's calm posture on the beach now seemed significant. Witnesses described him as relaxed, almost composed in death. Some believed he had accepted what was coming. That acceptance suggested he knew the outcome long before it happened. Perhaps he had been given a choice. Or perhaps he knew there was no escape. As rumors spread, the case began attracting attention from unexpected places. Former military personnel, intelligence analysts, and historians quietly examined the details. None spoke publicly, but whispers circulated. Whispers of secret meetings, hidden exchanges, and silent warnings delivered through poetry and code. The nurse's involvement also gained new meaning. If the Somerton man was connected to intelligence work, then anyone close to him could have been at risk. Her silence, once seen as suspicious, now looked like self-preservation. If she knew his true role, speaking out might have endangered her life and her child's future. Some investigators believed the nurse had been instructed to forget him, to deny him, to erase him from her memory as thoroughly as his labels had been cut away. In a world of secrets, denial could be an act of survival. Attention returned to the suitcase found at the train station. Its contents were simple but deliberate. Clothes of similar style, carefully packed. No signs of long-term travel. No souvenirs. Nothing sentimental. It looked less like the luggage of a traveler and more like the kit of someone on assignment. Even the train ticket raised questions. Why leave the suitcase behind? Why go to the beach without it? One theory suggested the suitcase had served its purpose. Whatever he needed from it had already been taken. The rest was meant to be found, just enough to confuse, not enough to explain. Another unsettling idea emerged. What if the Somerton man had not intended to die on that beach? What if something had gone wrong? Perhaps he had been meeting someone. Perhaps the beach was a rendezvous point. The cigarette tucked behind his ear could have been a signal, a small sign meant to identify himself to another person. When no one arrived, or when the meeting turned deadly, the plan ended there. Witness reports of a man standing near the beach the night before took on new importance. One witness remembered seeing him raise his arm, as if signaling to someone in the darkness. That small gesture, once dismissed, now felt loaded with meaning. As the spy theory gained strength, the absence of official records became even more troubling. Intelligence agencies, by nature, left little behind. Files were classified, destroyed, or never created at all. If the Somerton man had worked within such a system, his disappearance would not be an accident. It would be protocol. Police quietly reached out to government departments, hoping for confirmation or denial. None came. Doors remained closed. Questions went unanswered. The silence was louder than any confession. This lack of cooperation fueled public imagination. Some believed the government knew exactly who the Somerton man was and had chosen to keep it secret. Others argued the truth had been buried to avoid embarrassment or exposure of hidden operations. The idea that a man could die for reasons too dangerous to reveal captured the public's attention in a way few cases ever had. Years passed, and the spy theory became inseparable from the legend of the Somerton man. Books were written. Documentaries were planned. Each retelling added new layers of intrigue, even as concrete evidence remained frustratingly out of reach. Yet not everyone believed the theory. Critics pointed out that not all secrets belonged to spies. Some belonged to broken hearts, failed lives, and quiet despair. They argued that the Somerton man might have been an ordinary man caught in extraordinary circumstances, not a trained agent but a lonely figure overwhelmed by personal loss. Still, the unanswered questions refused to settle. Why the code? Why the erased identity? Why the careful staging of his final moments? As decades rolled on, the case aged into myth, but it never lost its power. The Somerton man became a symbol of mystery itself, a reminder that some lives pass through history without leaving footprints, even when they brush against the edges of great events. The spy theory did not offer closure, but it offered context. It painted the Somerton man not as a nobody, but as someone whose life was deliberately hidden, someone who mattered enough to be erased. In that interpretation, his death was not meaningless. It was the final consequence of a life lived in secrecy, where names were disposable and endings were quiet. If that was true, then the Somerton man's greatest secret was not who he was, but why he was never meant to be known. And somewhere, buried beneath classified files and forgotten agreements, the truth remained locked away, waiting for a world brave enough to face it. For decades, the Somerton man remained frozen in time, his story trapped between rumor and silence. Investigators came and went, theories rose and collapsed, and witnesses slowly disappeared into old age and death. The mystery survived generations, passed down like a modern legend, whispered about in books, documentaries, and late-night conversations. Many believed the truth would never be known, that the man on the beach would remain forever nameless. But time has a way of reopening doors that once seemed sealed shut. Long after the original investigators were gone, a new kind of detective entered the story. Not one armed with notebooks and witness statements, but with computers, databases, and strands of genetic code. Science had changed the rules. And for the Somerton man, it offered a final chance to speak. Permission was granted to exhume the body. It was a controversial decision, debated fiercely by those who believed the mystery should be left undisturbed. But curiosity won. When the remains were carefully uncovered, scientists worked with precision and respect. Tiny samples were taken, fragments of bone and tissue preserved across decades, waiting silently for this moment. DNA was extracted. At first, progress was slow. The genetic material was fragile, damaged by time and environmental exposure. But after months of work, a usable profile emerged. For the first time, the Somerton Man existed not just as a photograph or story, but as a genetic signature. Something that could be compared. Something that could connect. That connection came through public genealogy databases, the same tools that had solved cold cases around the world. Distant relatives began to appear. Faint matches scattered across family trees. None of them recognized the name Somerton Man, but their DNA told a shared story, branching backward through generations. Researchers followed those branches carefully, tracing lines of ancestry, narrowing possibilities, eliminating impossibilities. It was slow, patient work, filled with dead ends and cautious hope. But gradually, a picture began to form. The man on the beach had a family. He had been born somewhere else, far from Somerton Beach. He had parents, siblings, relatives who lived ordinary lives, unaware that one of their own had vanished so completely. His real name surfaced quietly, not announced with fanfare, but with a sense of disbelief. A name that belonged to a real person, recorded in birth records, school documents, and family memories. The Somerton Man was no longer just a mystery. He was someone. When the news reached the public, reactions were mixed. Some felt relief. Others felt disappointment, as if the magic of the mystery had been disturbed. But most felt something deeper. A strange sadness for a man who had lived and died without being known for who he truly was. Yet even with a name, the biggest questions remained. Why had he erased himself so thoroughly? Why had he removed every label, carried coded messages, and died alone on a beach far from his origins? Knowing who he was did not explain who he had been. Researchers studied his life as best they could. They found gaps, long stretches of time where records were thin or missing entirely, periods where he seemed to drift, moving from place to place, leaving little behind. These gaps felt important. They suggested transformation. A life divided into before and after. The connection to the nice returned to the center of the story. With modern science, what had once been speculation now gained weight. Genetic comparisons strongly suggested a biological link between the Somerton Man and her son. The resemblance that had once raised eyebrows now carried undeniable significance. The quiet niece, who had denied knowing him, suddenly became the keeper of a truth too heavy to carry publicly. Her silence took on new meaning. It no longer looked like deception for its own sake, but protection. Protection of herself, her child, and perhaps even the memory of a man she had known in a different life. If the Somerton Man had lived under another identity, acknowledging him could have shattered carefully built walls. Perhaps she had loved him once. Perhaps she had been forced to let him go. Perhaps the man she knew no longer existed by the time he returned to her city. The phrase tamam should echoed louder than ever. It is finished. In this final chapter, the words felt less like a message to the world and more like a private acceptance. A man closing the last door on a life he could no longer reclaim. A man choosing silence over explanation. The code in the poetry book was revisited one last time. With more context, some experts believed it was not meant to be decoded by strangers at all. It may have been a personal shorthand, a memory aid, or a message intended for one specific person. Without that person's voice, the code remained incomplete, like a sentence missing its ending. The spy theory softened but did not dissipate. While no official records confirmed intelligence involvement, the era, the behavior, and the secrecy still aligned too neatly to dismiss entirely. It became possible that the Somerton Man had lived at the edge of two worlds. One ordinary, one hidden. And when those worlds collided, the result was his quiet end. Others argued a simpler explanation. That he was a man burdened by regret, estranged from family, separated from love, and overwhelmed by choices he could not undo. That his death was not the result of orders or missions, but of exhaustion. Emotional, spiritual exhaustion. The truth may lie somewhere between those possibilities. What mattered most was this. The Somerton Man was no longer invisible. His story, once reduced to a body on a beach, now carried weight in humanity. He laughed once. He spoke someone's name with affection. He mattered to someone, even if that someone chose silence. As historians reflected on the case, they realized why it had endured for so long. It was not just about mystery. It was about identity, about how easily a person could disappear, and how fragile our connection to memory truly is. In the end, science did what time could not. It gave the Somerton Man a place in history, not as a riddle, but as a man whose life had been complicated, secretive, and deeply human. Yet even now, standing at the edge of resolution, some questions remain unanswered. Why the beach? Why that moment? Why choose poetry instead of words? Perhaps those answers belong only to him. Perhaps the final meaning of Tamamshud was never meant for investigators or audiences, but for the man himself. A quiet reassurance at the end of a long and difficult journey. It is finished. And at last, after decades of silence, the man with no identity could finally rest.